Welcome to Disarming Leviathan, a podcast designed to equip you to missionally engage American Christian nationalists. For more info on today's guest and our suite of resources, visit disarmingleviathan.com.
Scott, you've done a lot of work in the New Testament. And one of the things that I hear a lot come from the purveyors of American Christian nationalism is kind of random quotations. Often Romans 13 will be used, other texts that say things like, honor the empire, or honor the emperor, the government, bears the sword for a purpose. These are texts that some of the early church would have been familiar with. How do you understand the early church's perspective, their own self-perspective of themselves in relation to the empire?
Yeah, Caleb, this is a really good question. And I think it has to be answered on, let's say, a spectrum or a process. And that is, these are the earliest forms of Christianity trying to figure out how to live in the Roman Empire. It's not like they had a ready-made template for these sorts of things. Of course, in the Jewish world, in which, let's say, Paul, Jesus, Peter grew up, John, they all grew up in this world. The Jewish tradition knew of, let's just say, an undeniable, unrelenting resistance and repudiation of idolatry and immorality. Okay, so they knew how to resist. So whether you talk about Philo in Alexandria, whether you talk about Jewish Christians or even Jews in first century Rome, whether you talk about apocalyptic texts or straightforward historical texts like the Maccabees, you have very clear moments of resistance. They will not, for instance, Jews would not tolerate that Pilate wanted to usurp funds from the aqueduct or to put eagles on top of the gate into Jerusalem. So they knew how to resist. But what is amazing about Judaism in let's just say the first century and the first century BC was an ability to accommodate themselves and acclimate themselves to a context. So they had this tradition, the early Christians inherited, of accommodation to a limit. They would accommodate, if they lived in Alexandria, they knew the sorts of things that it was okay to do, and they knew the things that was not okay to do. So they would not eat pork, although there probably were some Jews who enjoyed pork, and some of them certainly had enjoyed shrimp. Why wouldn't they? But they had this tradition. So now that's a long context, but Paul exhibits in Romans 13 an accommodationist or acclamationist posture toward Rome. This is a small Christian community that had just gotten in trouble with Claudius. And Claudius had kicked out Jews, and maybe because they were Jewish Christians, had kicked them out of Rome. And under Nero, in the early days of Nero, who over time became a first-class idiot and jerk. I mean, he was really, to me, he's one of the most corrupted leaders ever. But when Nero takes over, he's attracting these people, and so they're returning. And Paul writes in about 56, if he'd have written this letter in 62 or 3, he would never have said what he said in 56, 54. Depends your dating. So he says, look, there's not very many of us, And the only way we're going to be able to get along and survive the Roman emperor is to accommodate ourselves to the environment. At the same time, there's plenty of evidence in Rome at the end of Romans 12 and throughout Romans 13 that this group of people would not have accommodated themselves to the point of eating meat offered to idols. They would not have participated in idolatry. They would not have participated in the Roman military. So they knew their limits. But Paul's strategy is we've got to be respectful, and maybe we'll get some honor for this. And he uses technical terms for social benevolence and public honors in Romans 13. Peter, I think in 1 Peter chapter 2 is very similar when he says honor the emperor. He says that we are pilgrims and sojourners, and I think those have technical terms about social status, but there's debates on this. But he says we should live such good lives among the pagans, the Gentiles, that when they see our behavior and they criticize us, they will recognize that what we're doing is good. And so Peter encourages these marginalized first century Christians in northwest Asia Minor, Turkey today. He tells them to do good, and that's a technical term for public benevolence. So that's one strategy. Another strategy is found in the book of Revelation, which is diametrically opposed because it's a different context, probably under Domitian. It might be under the later years of Nero, but that's a debate that no one is ever going to win on the dating of Revelation. And I just read something that dated it late, and I can't remember now what it was. It was just the other day. And Revelation is diametrically opposed to Rome because of its idolatrous connection to the goddess Roma. And it is chapters 17 and 18 are stinging criticisms of Rome. So we come away with early Christianity that is every bit like the Judaism that they grew up in. Is they knew when to accommodate and assimilate, and they knew when to resist. But the critical issue here, Caleb, and you know this very well, is what one person sees as accommodation, another person will see as idolatry.
That's right.
So there had to be some, let's say, informed discussions of what idolatry is and what it looks like. And John comes out swinging in the book of Revelation because of the idolatrous connection of anything that makes itself comfortable in Rome. And so we inherit in our New Testament a Jewish understanding of how to live in the empire. Accommodate so far as you don't compromise your principles. Early book of Acts, John, Peter, they learn this. We'll go along with you, but we believe in God, and we believe that God raised Jesus from the dead, and we're going to be witnesses to that. And if you want to kill us, we'll take it. We'll take the death. So they were witnesses. They knew how to accommodate, and they knew how far they could go. And they knew when it got to the line of idolatry and immorality, they resisted with their life if they needed to. Long-winded answer.
Oh, that's great. So we're thinking about the New Testament and how it shaped, or how the early church was also responding to its culture. Here we are so many years later. We have the book of Acts, the book of Romans, the book of Revelation. There are myriad perspectives on how to apply those things today. We live in somewhat of a different place. We have this like democratic republic thing. There's a voting that's happening. We seem to talk about valuing every voice. How might those texts and the example of those early churches shape us today?
Yeah, Caleb, I think I would say that we need to learn how to be um, in the culture and not of the culture. I mean, it's a simplistic answer, but it requires discernment.
Hmm.
I think the critical factor is our ability. Let me put it this way. If you've played on a pristine golf course, which I have played, okay, and then your son asks you to go with his son to cheap public golf course, you recognize that the fairways are bad, the greens are tiny, the sand trips are uncared for, the holes are short, and it's because you know what a good golf course looks like that you can discern a bad golf course. Okay. I'm thinking about this, Caleb, because I'm right now sitting in our condominium that we share with Chris's sister, a small condominium in Fort Myers, Florida, and I'm looking out at a golf course. Okay, so here's what I would say. If you recognize the glory of God in Jesus Christ and his matchless worth,
Hmm.
you will recognize when his name is being besmirched by accommodation and assimilation and syncretism and idolatry. So to me, there isn't a formula that we apply. You can say these words, but not those words. It is a capacity of a spiritually mature person who knows the vision of God in Christ so well that that person recognizes idolatry when it appears. Okay, now let me give you an example. I find an American flag behind a pulpit in a church idolatrous. Not because I'm not patriotic or not because I don't love the United States, which I do, but because the gospel is for all. And that is a narrowing of it. And because it symbolizes a form of allegiance that is inappropriate next to a cross. I grew up in a church that had two flags at the back, an American flag and a Christian flag. There was a Christian flag.
Yeah.
I don't even know if people have Christian flags anymore.
Oh, yeah, they do.
But they were the same height.
Yeah.
They were the same height. And that one of them was at one side of the choir loft and another one was at the other side. Now, that's my memory. That, I would say, at that time, I saw nothing. Today, I would say completely idolatrous. It's totally inappropriate. Furthermore, we only have a Christian flag as a sort of accommodation to an American flag.
Mm-hmm.
Why do we need a Christian flag? We have a cross.
Right.
The cross is what we use as a symbol for the Christian faith, not a flag. That's like saying, well, the Americans have a flag, and so we're going to have a flag too, and we're going to put them together.
Mm.
So that's one. And here's where I think it gets to be a little bit trickier, but to me, it is even more obvious. And that is, where is a person's heart and where is a person's passion?
Hmm.
And what I am recognizing is an obsession with politics in the evangelical church today at a level that supplants and replaces an obsession with Christ and the gospel, let's say evangelism and fellowship and Christianity. And I think social media has the capacity to capture us with its messages and lead us into the idolatry of being obsessed with political candidates. Now, the first presidential election that I remember was President Kennedy's election. And my parents were not politically partisan in a way that I knew which party they belonged to. My parents were in their 80s before they actually said overtly that they voted Democrat. And they voted Democrat not because of their instincts, but because my father was a public school teacher, and public school teachers favored unions, the union, so they voted Democrat. And my father's family was Democrat. My father's father was a union worker in a coal mine. But I remember Kennedy, and I will say that passions have always been strong during elections, but there's been a 24/7, 365 world without end passion about elections today that I've never seen in my life. And okay, I'm glad people care about the political process that much, but when that becomes the driving force of our life, that is idolatrous.
So being consumed by something, it does seem like in scripture we have this, like, you worship a thing and it will consume you, giving yourself over to it.
Yeah.
You mentioned that discernment is one of the key factors here as we're trying to navigate how we live out the way of King Jesus in this moment. And yet, even in your own experience with the two flags, younger Scott maybe had a different view than older Scott about the flags on the stage. What should we do then? What wisdom would you give to us as we're sitting with people in our own family, our own church, our workplace, who also say that they follow King Jesus, and yet they're on the other side of this? You know, they love what's going on with, let's say, Christian nationalism or this power mongering or fear mongering. They just love it because the people who are propagating it are using God talk. How might we engage that person in a way that would be like Jesus?
Yeah. Well, I would say the younger Scott was a child and a teen who didn't have any political consciousness. But this didn't arise for me until, let's say, I was probably 30 years old. And then since then, I've adhered to this view. I think the goal in conversations with people who are committed to, let's say, Christian nationalism or an uber form of patriotism that we find to be at least on the border, if not over the line, is first of all to recognize that our goal is not to win an argument or to convert a person, but first of all to witness to the lordship of Jesus Christ. Secondly, to explain our view. Third, to offer critique of that view. And fourth, the goal should be to be heard rather than to win. I have a friend who is writing about this and has been working on this for about 5 years. His name is Drew Strait. He has a wonderful book about this. I can't remember the title now, but it's a really good book, and I blogged through it. And his whole approach is to help churches understand Christian nationalism. We had a good conversation, and I said I don't think that that we should get trapped in a goal of trying to convince someone, because this is a lot of this is confirmation bias at a different level. This is, in many ways, people defending let's say, a traditional, let's say, a perspective, a narrative, a story, a myth of what America was like. And they are defending this as they fear the collapse of the America that they grew up with. So to them, there's just all kinds of things that are connected here. And if we, let's say, try to knock away one chink, let me help you explain Romans 13 in a different way. That won't move. That won't move that person at all.
Mm-hmm.
Because, okay, they can give up Romans 13, but the driving force of all of it is a fear of the collapse of America, of the collapse of the American dream, of a collapse of what they perceive to be Christian America, all these sorts of things. And it's a much bigger perspective. And they think, Caleb, I don't know how you get into politics on your podcast, but people who perceive Donald J. Trump as a serious Christian are seriously blinded.
Mm-hmm.
It's just simply not true. And to believe that is, to me, is to reveal that they're in a tribe that will defend at all costs, because of confirmation bias is that anything they hear, they have an answer to, and they have an alternative to, and they can find it on Google.
Mm-hmm.
And they can find what they're looking for. So to me, I think our goal should be, first of all, again, to witness to the Lord Jesus Christ, the Lordship of Christ, and to explain our view, to be able to answer some of the critique that we think, or present some of the critique. But the goal is to be heard and to wait for, let's say, reason and alternative communities to engulf these people in a different worldview. I think it's a fact of sociology that if you could take those people one at a time and plant them in a different social group, a different community, that, let's just say it's a bunch of Mennonites,
Mm-hmm.
over time they would be converted to a different viewpoint, and they would begin to see the darkness of the view that they had. So as long as they are entrenched and they have their feet dug into a community that is strongly, let's say, Christian nationalist, it's going to be very difficult to remove them from that scene and to get them to see something from a different angle and to change their mind. So, form a pocket of Christians who are worshiping Jesus Christ and who have a different viewpoint, and see if you could incorporate them into their Bible studies,
Mm-hmm.
and to see an alternative viewpoint. But
That's right.
it's slow, and it's going to take a lot of time.
Yeah, we found that in our congregation.
Strange Worship is the book by
Yes.
Drew Strait. Very good book.
Yeah,
Very
Drew's
good
a
book.
friend and a friend of the show. So,
he is.
Yeah, we've chatted with him. He's been a great help to me personally as well. And in our congregation, we find that that's so true, that if what many people are finding inside Christian nationalist movements and other toxic tribes like that is a sense of safety, belonging, and purpose. And the ideology is only in service of those things.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And so when you ask someone to change their idea, it feels that their safety, belonging, and purpose are under imminent threat, because if they ask the wrong questions, they'll be excluded from the communion.
That's right.
And so underneath any conversation about changing one's mind must be a space of safety, belonging, and purpose, that you and I are okay regardless of this conversation. I want to be with you. I'm not going to exclude you from this, but let's have a conversation. And so it's striking to me, Scott, how so many of us want to be about the business of flipping tables, and yet Jesus is constantly setting them and inviting the other into the conversation.
That's good. Good image.
And if we don't set the tables, Jonathan Haidt is always on about this, that the mind only changes when the heart is ready and when the heart feels safe. And so I love what you're saying of, we're going to have this conversation, but we're also going to do so in the context of a community that provides
George,
safety.
when I was in college, much younger than you are, I heard a lecture by a philosopher at Michigan State University named George Mavrodes.
Mm-hmm.
He was kind of a philosophy of religion guy, very sharp. And my philosophy professor, whom I just respected and loved, named Ron Mayers, I believe had done a PhD with Mavrodes. At least he knew him really well. No, Ron did his PhD at Syracuse, but he knew Mavrodes. And Mavrodes was asked, or somehow it came up in the conversation. And this is one of those events where the gist of what was said is so deep in my mind and so impactful that I can't reconstruct the precise event, but I know what was going on. And that is, he was asked about how people change their mind, and he made a statement. People do not change their ways and their mind because of reason. They change their mind because of people they trust have a different viewpoint.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's I think that's exactly what Drew that's what Drew and I have talked about, is that we have to provide alternative communities where a different worldview on Christian nationalism is at work in such a way that Christian nationalism will be exposed for what it is because of what we know in that community.
That's right. Yeah, to continue your metaphor, when you experience the grade A golf course, you don't want to go back to the Muni course.
That's right.
Right. And so creating a community that actually provides safety, belonging, and purpose, which the Jesus community does.
Yeah. Yeah.
And my encouragement to listeners is it is frustrating and it takes a long time, oftentimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yet you find that people do change over time because they feel like they belong and they feel safe. And so they're ready to open their mind to new ideas. Scott, just shifting gears, one of the things that I've noticed and many have noticed is that there is within American evangelicalism today this phenomenon of winking at blatantly evil behavior in leaders who claim the name of Christ. Dehumanizing speech, belittling speech, bullying, violent speech, coming from political leaders that are claiming the name of Christ. You've done a lot of work also on corruption and evil inside leadership within the evangelical church. A lot of your work on a church called Tove and others are helping us rethink, okay, what do we expect out of our leaders? How do you see the correlation of, however long it's been, evangelicals' kind of acceptance of or winking at corrupt and brokenness in their leaders inside the church, giving way to doing the very same thing in the political realm as long as they are on our team? You see a correlation between those things?
Yes, I do. It's a complicated question too, and it revolves complicated answers. I would say that, number one, we have created a culture in which people like this flourish. Let's say corrupted leaders who present a persona on the platform as a pastor on Sunday morning that we fall in love with, that we grow from, that we adore, etc. We've created that kind of culture where that sort of thing can flourish. Mm-hmm. So when we discover that they, let's just say, have had multiple affairs or are stealing money seems to be more serious than sex in some of these people.
Hmm.
I mean, you start taking money, and then people might say, I don't want that pastor anymore. But, okay, so that's one thing. The second thing is people have a hard time denying. When they discovered that Bill Hybels at Willow Creek was who he was, they had a very difficult time connecting that to all the good that he had done in their life. So this is another instance of confirmation bias. And they've tried to find explanations that would not lead to a collapse of their entire perspective on the person and the church and the ministry. So they said, we're all sinners. We should be focusing on grace. We should forgive and forget. All the while not recognizing that, number one, there are qualifications for leaders in churches, and even more importantly, there is a failure to address and confront or encounter the damage that has been done to other people by people who they deem to be spiritual leaders. And so the result of that is they end up rewounding the wounded and forgiving the wounders. There's so much of this. Now, my wife is a psychologist, and she would say churches, over 90% of the time, will immediately believe the pastor's narrative or the church's narrative and will deny the narrative of the allegations and the stories of the wounded. There are cases when people make stories up, and I've been involved with a couple of these where I've seen stories, and when I read them, I went, this one's not true. But I'm hesitant even to say that, because that will mean the true wounders will immediately say, okay, see, that's my case too.
Right.
So, I think we've got that. Then, to me, the critical thing is Christians lack moral judgment and discernment, so that when they see this kind of behavior, they say, person's got to go. All right. Now, I think you know this. I think I know this, is that it can take a long time with someone before you recognize that that person's a corrupted person and they shouldn't be in Christian leadership. All right. People who are on platforms and who are successful are very good at creating and nurturing a persona. They're very good at this.
Mm-hmm.
And we can begin to equate the persona with the person. It's not the case, but we do. It's unavoidable. We nurture and curate our public image. And to be honest with you, this is why I do not like all the self-revelations of social media. This is what I'm like. And when I see someone who's always talking about themselves, now look, I put stuff on social media every day from my Substack. And every now and then I tell a story about myself a little bit, but I do not like that side of doing things. But sometimes we have to tell our own story. But we are masters at curating our persona. And this is a part of the church life that we just need to have more discerning people. I don't think the solution is accountability. I think the solution is character discernment on the part of search committees to find leaders who truly are spiritually formed people and who can lead in a healthy direction and from a healthy spiritual life.
Mm-hmm. So we see that in the church. How might we apply that in our politics and the people that we advocate for?
Yeah, I forgot about the politics. Yeah. I mean, if you can't recognize it in your pastor, you're certainly not going to care about the moral character of a president.
Mm-hmm.
okay, here's an example. I'm going to use Al Mohler as an example. I don't know Al Mohler personally. I have corresponded a couple times. Al Mohler said we cannot vote for Donald Trump the first time he ran for election because of his moral filth. Okay. Then he changed his mind a little bit. And now in this last election, he has supported him, holding his nose.
Sure.
What happened? What happened was his community threatened the viability of his ministry so much that he changed to the community and therefore forfeited his originally wise and accurate moral discernment that Trump was disqualified morally from leadership anywhere, especially in the United States as the president. Okay, so there's an example.
So how might you coach us? We've got friends and family who are not only not calling out errant behavior in the leaders, but actually saying, well, that's all lies. Actually, he's a godly man. He's the Lord's anointed. He's the chosen one. So it's not just, oh, it's morally neutral. It's actually what's happening right now is of God. How might you coach us as we kind of conclude our time together?
Wrong. It's wrong.
Yeah.
And those who call corruption good are morally blind people. Now, I can't say that directly to these people, but I would say that on your podcast. And I would say that those who think Donald Trump is a godly, morally formed Christian leader are blind to the truth. And they need to check their souls with God, read the scriptures, and find out what a godly leader is actually like.
And we can do that, I think, helped by some of your work.
I hope
that
so.
You've done. I hope so too. Where can people find you and your work, Scott?
Well, I'm out there. If they Google my name and spell Scott with one T, they'll probably find me. And even if they use two T's, they'll find me. I have a Substack, Scot McKnight Substack. I'm on Blue Sky, which seems to be doing pretty well. I'm on Threads. I'm on Instagram. I have an old X account that doesn't seem to be losing people, but I don't use it at all. But I have books, and you can find me on Amazon. So I guess, and I'm on Facebook.
There you go. Well, I have benefited so much from your work. Your scholarship has blessed our congregation as well. It's been very formative in a variety of different ways. So it's an honor to have you on, and I appreciate you giving the time to us today.
Well, thanks, Caleb. This was a pleasant conversation, and God bless the work that you're doing.
Thanks, sir.